How you doing? I'm Sean Sherman. I'm the developer of the Reset System.
My name is Jonathan Lose. I'm the Director of Education of the Reset System. And today we're going to talk about interpreting distorted output of the human movement system. And it's kind of a mouthful, right? Looking at
Say that again. What is it?
Interpreting the distorted output of the human movement system.
Got it.
And people would say, well, is that dysfunction? Is that altered movement? Is that poor posture? And I think
I would say yes.
Yeah.
And how do you define dysfunction? Because I think it's a term that gets thrown around there. It's pretty much anything that somebody sees with their eyes they don't like. That's a dysfunction.
Yeah, red flag with what they see with their eyes. Oh, that's altered movement, or hey, you're rounded in the shoulders, and and sometimes, and I guess the basis of what we're talking about is how do you address to uncover the source of that, and once you uncover the source of that, it directs your intervention to change and fix that.
Okay.
And before you even get into that, you look at different classification of syndromes or different aspects, and I think when we look at the tool that we use mostly is Reset, and it's a very effective tool, but we have to consider some of the limitations. And when we look at like patients that have or clients that have distorted movement or distorted posture or a red flag for us that we observe, if it's not like a serious illness like cancer or some crazy autoimmune disorder with inflammatory condition or compromise to the structural system, so like
fractured bones, torn ligaments to
or lesions in the nervous system or spinal damage. I mean, we're talking about patients or clients that have intact hardware.
Correct.
They might be adaptive, but not super adaptive like stenosis or inflammation like frozen shoulder. And those are just processes that have to work themselves out. But we're looking at people that have onset of pain, complaint of pain, altered movement, or altered...
and commonly, they don't know where it came from.
Right.
So not typically, not that we can't help people who have traumatized tissue, but it's usually these slowly developing over time pain syndromes. Because a whole lot of people end up finding this.
So chronic. But again, not with the adaptive component. And not that that's not unique to Reset, it's just that we're at least acknowledging limitations, and a lot of systems do. Like McKenzie classification does that 90% of the population is effective, but you classify into people that just won't respond, stenosis or serious illness, red flags type components. So we're just kind of following that aspect of, hey, if there's no structural change, nervous system's intact, muscles intact, skeletal system's intact, and you still have dysfunction or pain, it's a process. It's most likely a processing issue.
So and how do we break that down? How do we go from symptom to uncovering the source of the symptom? That's what we're mostly going to talk about right here.
Right. And I think getting into that, we have to start to break down like buzzwords or definitions, and we're kind of really sharing the fundamental of how Reset is predicated on.
So get your notepads out and steal all of our good ideas.
So I think the first aspect is looking at the human body from a three-dimensional aspect, but not from this really static anatomical position, but really giving substance to the term of this triplanar motion.
Right, because it gets thrown around a lot, and people throw it out there, and I'm not sure if people who are throwing out there even have a concept of what it is. I think some do, but they're kind of giving a lot of lip service from what I've seen.
Right, and appreciating the fact that joints don't move in isolation, that there's a predominant joint plane of motion that occurs, but, and we're not talking about physiological versus accessory joint motion.
Right.
We're talking about just in the physiological component, like flexion, extension, internal, like the cardinal planes, that when you're moving, it's a dominant plane that's moving, so like shoulder flexion, the glenohumeral joint, but you're also getting other elements from the three planes. And so instead of isolating joint motion in terms of a specific planar dominance, considering or at least appreciating that the concept of triplanar motion, all three planes coming into that, and there's already terms out there that nicely explain that. It's the term pronation and supination.
Exactly.
And we by no means taking claim to that terminology.
Absolutely not.
We're just taking it to help us keep track of what we're looking at through basic human movement.
Right.
And so basically we look at, instead of looking at a joint and looking at what it's the movement there, we're looking at the responsibilities of, is it pronating when it needs to pronate? And is it supinating when it needs to supinate? And we're not talking about just wrist movement or arch movement. We're talking about when that joint is collapsing with gravity through all three planes.
At all segments.
At all segments. Or is that joint and its mechanical link, is that pronating or supinating when it needs to supinate? So is it accelerating against gravity, or is it controlling movement decentrically with gravity?
And there isn't a third choice.
There is, right, and it's you're right, that's a good point, is that human movement is binary.
Right.
At any given moment, it's either the nervous system is telling the muscles to tell the joints to either relax and collapse with gravity, control that, or accelerate and overcome that. And that's it. If someone tells you anything else is a third option,
Right. And there's transitions, but it's really always one or the other.
right? It's binary. All of biology, all of human nature, all of everything on this planet is binary.
The universe.
It's either on or off.
Right.
It's contracting, it's accelerating, deaccelerating. Nothing's truly ever static.
Right. So that explanation and kind of breaking down how the necessity to account for three-dimensional movement from one segment to another leads into what we would call resets fundamental movement patterns.
Right, which again, we're not taking claim to basic patterns. It's just that it's when we have to reduce down to human movement, and we look at the isolated joint components of pronation, supination, and then we look at how they interrelate through the kinetic chain. We have to have a reference point of foundation. And these aren't things that we created either. These are things that you observed, tested, and reduced down to.
Everybody.
Right.
Not just on this age group or that age group or this population, but across the board, human beings.
Paradox-free.
Paradox-free.
So the fundamental movement was everything that is innate to the human being from birth to development isn't the crawling and rolling and twisting. These are elements that lead to the number one fundamental position, which is static standing.
Getting upright.
Posture against gravity, right?
Yep.
And that's only in existence to allow for ambulation.
Correct.
And those, in fact, are the two fundamental patterns.
Getting upright, ambulating.
Right. And it's so ingrained that these movements this exists at the central pattern generator in the brainstem itself. So there's research that's evolving. I mean, Vladimir Janda had started that aspect, his observation that there's either that posture and gait are your two fundamental patterns. And there's a huge movement of developmental kinesiology right now that I'm not discrediting. It's just that they're trying to reduce movement back into these
useful,
well, primitive patterns when you have one single curve in your spine and lever lengths are different and it's immature gait versus mature gait. And as a patient coming in, I guess that's an assumption that we're making is that there is mature gait there, right?
Right. We're trying to optimize mature gait, not optimize.
Right. These subcortical reflexive movements that maybe have some questionable merit in motor control research and systematic. So that's a whole other aspect. But bottom line, through the clinical observations that we've made and the reproducible system that we've been able to share with students, that the fundamental movement is gait and standing. So static standing and dynamic ambulation.
And I would say we probably want to break down how those kind of further subdivide into phases. So it's pronation, supination.
Well, I think that you just did it right there. Is that when we look at if joints can either be pronating or supinating at any given time, and that's looking at the isolated component, and looking at the global component, it's following the predictable pattern that should happen of during standing, looking at global supination.
Yep.
Through all
the joints are going through an extension, extension, what am I missing here? External rotation and abduction type stuff.
And then, or are they going into a sit pattern, which is pronation going into a sit pattern, which is global pronation through the entire kinetic chain.
Right, so your body's either going with or overcoming gravity. There's your getting upright.
There's no other option. The body can't do anything else, right?
Yep.
And then when you look at ambulation, you're looking at reciprocal and inverse. So you're looking at quadrant aspect. You're looking at what the axial skeleton do and what the appendicular skeleton is doing. And you're either pronating through the right lower quadrant and through the left upper quadrant, and you're simultaneously supinating at the right upper quadrant and low, right? And that's lower left, and that is fundamental. And during gait, the body shouldn't be doing anything else.
Right, and that would be one half of the gait, the other half would be just reverse it.
Right, the storage of that energy.
Right.
So that's fundamental, and that's the basis of reset. Going through and finding that predictable pattern of, is the joint pronating when it's supposed to be pronating in that instance? And it should be supinating.
Okay.
Then that leads us to
break it down further to figure out how is the body currently compensating.
Well, I think that instead of how it's compensating, I think we need to define compensation itself.
All right, let's go with that.
So if we look at a pattern of the body either globally supinating, globally pronating, let's say in a sit-stand pattern, if the body needs to borrow resources from somewhere, The only option is moving away from pain and towards stability, towards gain, right? That's if we accept.
When you're saying pain, you're talking generally pain.
I'm talking about motivation. Like when you look at when you look at either at any given nature is either moving away from learning, moving away from pain towards gain, or simultaneously. Well, if we talk about this binary nature of human movement at the joint level and through the pattern level, is that if the joint's either pronating or supinating, and it's not comfortable supinating, the only option it has is to move towards
favor
pronation. Correct. Right? So when people talk about compensation, they talk about all these crazy, like, oh, the knees dive in, so compensation here with the L.
Right.
Basically what they're saying is compensation is either moving towards pronation or towards supination.
Right.
And
they're more like we're really reporting the distortions to pick up with their eyeballs. That we would kind of lump that into distorted outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Right. Because we're not looking at range of motion to us just means that something's wrong.
Yeah, like a restriction in range of motion or some deviation from.
But it can come somewhere through. If the body is dependent upon pronation, supination through the entire kinetic chain, it's going to borrow resources through that entire kinetic chain if need be.
Right.
And the only way it can borrow resources, if it's not comfortable pronating, it's going to favor supinating. If it's not favoring supination, it's going to favor pronation.
Right, and then to draw it back into our patterns, the body could be borrowing from left step to offset right step.
Correct.
So we're basically breaking down compensatory movement to either saying the compensatory pattern is this half of the phase of gait or the other half, or this half phase of getting upright or the other half.
Whatever it may be, right? So it sounds complicated, but it's really predicated on binary system of looking at pronation, supination at the particular joint, and then the joint responsibility functionally. So looking at the we'll get into that. Because if there is compensation, that means that there's some reason for it to compensate.